Hello everybody, this is tRUcrime podcast from the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, where we discuss Russian propaganda, hybrid threats, and the influence tools they use. The topic of our conversation today is how Russian propaganda spreads discriminatory narratives against the LGBTQIA+ community. We uncover the tactics Russia uses to stigmatize and marginalize individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. Stigmatizing the otherness. As the Russian-Ukrainian war continues to shape the nation's identity and choices, Moscow has cunningly employed the narrative of preserving traditional values to justify its anti-Western policy and military aggression against Ukraine, which they claim are curated by the West. In Putin's full-scale invasion address on the morning of February the 24th, 2022, he emphasized the importance of protecting traditional values as a shield against what they perceive as harmful Western influences.
They, the collective West, sought to destroy our traditional values and force on us their false values that would erode us, our people from within, the attitudes they have been aggressively imposing on their countries, attitudes that are directly leading to degradation and degeneration because they are contrary to human nature. This is not going to happen.
This rhetoric not only influences their political course but also reflects a binary worldview, pitting healthy and normal Russian values rooted in tradition against the perceived weak and pervert values of the West, which they believe lead to degradation. To illustrate this, the United Russia pro-government political party proposed a straight flag as a symbolic expression of Russia's anti-LGBTQIA+ struggle, contrasting it with the pride flag. Political homophobia. Over the last decade, homophobia has become deeply institutionalized in Russian society and in politics. In 2013, Russia passed the infamous anti-gay law, banning the propaganda of homosexuality among children to protect traditional family values. This law was redefined in 2022 to criminalize the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations across all age groups, leading to severe penalties for Russian citizens and organizations, and even the expulsion from Russia for foreigners who engage in such activities. This means that not only human rights abuse, but also a ban for every mention of LGBTQIA+ topics, which can be considered a violation of the law. This resulted in even more absurd ramifications, such as fining theatres for showing films depicting queer people as gay propaganda, fining Google for refusing to delete videos containing gay propaganda, and even censoring the songs. This was the case with Beyoncé's If I Were a Boy, which was in Russia renamed to If I Had a Boy, to avoid propaganda of transsexuality. It was also followed by the State Duma's proposal to screen the social networks of migrants and Russian citizenship applications for extremism, discrediting the Russian armed forces, and propaganda of non-traditional values. Besides using homophobia as a weapon in Russia's battle for traditional values, Russian propaganda does everything possible to incite it in Russian society, turning it into an instrument for consolidating and strengthening the us versus them opposition. As of 2022, 1 in 5 LGBTQIA+ people in Russia experienced physical violence because of their sexuality or transgender status, and 1 in 3 experienced threats. Next is the testimony of one of the representatives of the queer community in Russia.
There was a lot of violence against me. I lived in a small town. I was an open LGBT person and faced various situations. A lot of horrors happened. Once, I was almost drowned. It is difficult to describe and remember.
Using homophobic rhetoric and slurs to discredit and demonize any opposition movements, political leaders or international organizations is thus a classic Russian propaganda tactic. The collective West was frequently blamed for roughly imposing LGBTQI+ agenda, propagating false values and perversion. In the world of disinformation, even President Biden was depicted as gay, with implications that he was weak and an indecisive leader. NATO wasn't spared either, as Russian propaganda painted the alliance as an aggressive bloc governed by LGBTQI+ interests, a notion that might seem contradictory from a critical perspective. Ukraine and its government have not been exempt from these propagandistic attacks, obviously, since the war's onset in 2014. Homophobic rhetoric has been weaponized against the Ukrainian president, coupled with baseless accusations of drug addiction, all aimed at creating a negative contrast with the Russian president's carefully crafted image of masculinity, albeit by our analysis, toxic, and the defender of conservative values and the traditional family institute. The queer community is systematically associated with weakness in this narrative, while toxic masculinity and machoism are praised as virtues. This is why the caricature portraying the Russian president with a clown nose and a pride flag colours provoked the Russian embassy in Switzerland to release an official statement claiming the denigration of honour and dignity of the Russian leader, threatening a lawsuit.
As for the personality of the President of the Russian Federation, he, as you know, is a deeply religious Orthodox person advocating the preservation of traditional Christian values in Russian society and is clearly not a fan of the LGBTQIA community, and therefore the rainbow coloring of his face is ridiculous.
How Russia defends the traditional values. Adam Dilim-Kahanov, a close ally of the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, declared the intention to fight Satanism and LGBTQI+ in Belgorod, together with classic claims about the liberation of the Ukrainian people.
Wherever they are, we will go over and destroy Free Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps fighting for Ukraine and liberate the Ukrainian people from this LGBTQIA, satanic, fascist regime led by this LGBTQIA person Zelensky.
As queer people are now defending Ukraine in the ranks of the country's armed forces, equal rights for the LGBTQI+ community are now vitally important as a declaration of support and solidarity on the state level to guarantee the fundamental rights and liberties for all Ukrainians. To answer this problem, a draft law for the legalization of civil partnerships for heterosexuals and same-sex couples, after gaining the required number of signatories from Ukrainian citizens, was then later submitted to the Ukrainian parliament. Unsurprisingly, Russian propaganda jumped on the initiative to promote the disinformation narrative about the end of the Family Institute in Ukraine on the demand of Western curators. This was then taken up a notch, with Russian propaganda pushing scary narratives about children changing their sex and families with so-called Parent 1 and Parent 2 instead of mother and father. With all gender equality and anti-discriminatory measures in Ukraine being systematically ridiculed by the Russian state apparatus, the personal attacks against Ukrainian MP Inna Sovsun reached a new level. Russian propaganda named her and other liberal Ukrainian politicians as a Sorosenok, Russian derogative for a George Soros puppet working for Western grants and promoting LGBTQIA+ agenda. The word is created by analogy with Porosenok, Russian word for piglet. This slur is also used by Russian researchers when they describe leaders of states that do not support Russia. For example, Natalia Mikhaeva, Deputy Director of the Center for Geopolitical Expertise, live on air, Russian propagandist Solovyov said the following.
As for Pashinyan, this is a strange character. He is another proof that where Soros supporters come to power, and Pashin really is a sucker, there is instability, civil war, and loss of territories. The same applies to Moldova and the situation with Transnistria.
One such example is the Istanbul Convention, a key condition for Ukraine's NATO accession, which later became a target of waves of disinformation spread through Russian-backed Telegram channels and traditional Russian media. Russian propaganda consistently employs tactics of ridicule, marginalization, and mockery to undermine Ukraine's fight against discrimination and equality. An annual event like Pride, held in Ukraine, is maliciously portrayed by Russian propaganda as a gay parade and a homosexual walk, or even more ridiculous, as propaganda of homosexuality and gender change. Slurs and humiliation as the instruments of marking the other. Language plays a pivotal role in this information war, as Russia weaponizes everything, including liberal values. Terms like soy, used derogatorily to describe liberals and pacifists, are equated with crimes against morality and Russian identity. The derogative term liberist, derived in a similar pattern as pederast, is used not only to stigmatize LGBTQI+ identity, but also to mark liberal values as other and abnormal. For example, Russian singer and producer Grigory Lips complained about Russia in such a way.
Some pederasts, Anglo-Saxon politicians, quarrel two Slavic peoples, and they get high from it.
Russian propaganda seeks to construct a national myth based on strength and greatness, encouraging the impression of the other, perceived as weaker or different. The genocidal war against Ukraine is justified by spreading messages that Ukrainians need to be liberated from the LGBTQIA+ agenda imposed by the West. This narrative aligns with the idea that Ukraine and Russia are one nation, further blurring the lines between aggression and nationalism. The dehumanization of Ukrainian defenders as Nazis looking forward to going to Bandera's gay paradise and dying for the queer insanity aims to portray Russia as the sole defender of traditional values and family institutions. This narrative serves to distract from the unjustified war of annihilation against Ukrainians and the commission of war crimes, attempting to evade collective responsibility. Sex education initiatives are also demonized by Russian propaganda, branding them as LGBTQIA+ propaganda and fornication of Ukrainian children. Russia frames its war against Ukraine and the West as a battle of values, portraying it as a mission to protect the Russian people from what they term LGBTQIA+ vermin, and a world where being normal is forbidden. Let's summarize. To sum up, Russian propaganda often vilifies the collective West for promoting LGBTQIA+ values in opposition to traditional Russian values. Homophobia is weaponized to discredit human rights initiatives and undermine Ukraine's fight against discrimination. This episode of the podcast sheds light on the impact of this propaganda in Russia and neighbouring countries, calling for solidarity and countermeasures to address these harmful narratives. As for what Ukraine should do, the country needs to continue promoting and protecting the rights of LGBTQIA+ individuals. This includes repealing discriminatory laws and actively supporting initiatives that ensure equal rights and protections for all citizens, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Moreover, engaging in public awareness campaigns and education to combat misinformation and disinformation is crucial. Strengthening ties with the international partners and organizations that champion LGBTQIA+ rights can offer valuable support. Ultimately, by fostering an inclusive and accepting society, Ukraine can effectively challenge the harmful effects of Russian propaganda and work towards building a more tolerant and progressive nation.